Okay, this is Dr. Marston recording the video lecture for the third week of psychological testing and assessment. And what I'm going to do this week is go through the um, summary of guidelines at the end of the book about how to interpret the TAT. Now, before I do this, I want to walk you through what the next 2 weeks of the class are going to look like, because there's some crossover here between what we are covering in the video lecture and then what you're going to be reading about to prepare for the next live lecture. Because at the next live lecture, we're going to talk about test development. You have readings this week on test development. I have submitted, I think there are 4 articles in there that I want you to read. Now, as you read those articles, you may very well come across material that you don't understand um, fully yet. Now, there's a couple reasons. One is that you're all PhD students, so you should have some exposure to things like reliability and validity. If you don't, I really would strongly urge that if you read some in one of those articles that you just have never heard of before, that you look it up real quickly online because you should have some familiarity. Every undergraduate program at least touches on test development. But having said that, if you go through the articles, um, uh, and there are concepts that you don't remember ever hearing, or maybe it's more that you heard them and you just forget what it is. Keep reading through the article, but keep that in your back of your mind because when we meet on Thursday, I will be going through some um, basics about test development. Test development will make up a large part of Thursday's class. I just didn't want to do test development in this video lecture because we still have things to talk about the thematic apperception test and your exam next week is about the TAT and the projective tests. So I wanted to get as much of that material out of the way so that between the material to clarify some of the stuff that you're reading. So between that material and the material we covered in the live lectures, your readings, and the one article that you do have due for this Thursday, which you will look in there and see that has to do with the validity of the TAT in Brazil. Um, that makes some good reference to what is already known about the validity of the TAT. So I wanted to talk about the TAT interpretation here because I wanted you to have that material for when you take the exam next week. So, as I think I said before, I'm using the first edition of this book only because I don't have notes in the newer version. Uh, but the summary in the appendix of the interpretive method for the TAT is the same here for the most part. So what I wanted to so anyway, there are several major parts of um, analyzing the TAT, and what you are looking at is perceptual integration, concrete versus abstract thinking. So perceptual integration. How is material from um, uh, the story that the client presents, how does that match up with what is actually in the picture? So perceptual integration, concrete versus abstract thinking, um, information processing, how is reasoning and uh, this person's storytelling ability and time perspective used in the story that they give. And then we're also looking at conceptualization of emotions, emotional maturity, emotional maturity, how autonomy is used, and motivation as it's reflected in the story. And what you are doing is taking a look at how each of these things are presented in the story. And the way you take a look at uh, and the way that you take a look at um, analyzing stories, you sort of keep track of these things for each card that you present. And if you find a pattern as far as a repetitive um, uh, level of um, uh, integrative problems or difficulties, or certain themes coming out, or certain difficulties sort of evident pretty frequently throughout the set of cards, that's something you want to focus on. So I'll talk about that more as we go on, but let's start with perceptual integration. Okay, the first question that you want to look at when someone's giving your response, their response is whether what they report is congruent with the stimuli. Does it match what's in the picture? And as they present in the book, and I'm just going to read it straight from there and talk about a few of them, some things you're looking for. Is there evidence that there is a disregard or misperception of the basic emotions or relationship? Do they describe someone as seeming happy when it seems to clearly be a sad picture? Do they describe happiness where there's gloom? Other things to look at as far as seeing whether there's this congruence between what's in the picture and what the person is reporting. Does there seem to be a misconception of the person's age? Do they seem to be misinterpreting um, the age? Other things there, are they focusing on irrelevant stimulus detail, um, or do they um, seem to go back and forth on what different parts of the picture mean? So they describe it one way one time and describe it another way another time. Um, Limited interpretations of emotions, um, and is there any evidence that they're not adequately relating different parts of the picture that are clearly related? So you want to look for the degree of congruence with the stimuli in each paragraph, and then you want to look at the different levels of integration. So one thing you want to do is look at specific aspects of how the picture is congruent with the stimuli, but time series, how they're related. But then you want to get a sort of overall sense of how well they integrate the picture, and that's usually um, on a range of 4 levels. And level 4 is the most accurate, and that just means, and I'll describe it here, all cues and subtleties are accounted for in terms of the interpretation of feelings and relationships. And then that's the highest level, that's the best. And then the next one is what's called level 1, or I'm sorry, the worst one is called level 1, and that's discrepant, it's called in here. But it basically means that the perception is inappropriate. There's something wrong with overall what they're perceiving and how they're perceiving relationships and how they're perceiving emotions. It's just all off. Okay, so what is this a measure of? I mean, you can take things about, but this sort of connects up because we want to not only talk about how you go about interpreting it, the test, like as far as what you're looking for, but what does it mean? And basically, perceptual integration is is seen as relating to how the person interprets stimuli, because the picture is first and foremost a stimuli. So, do they focus on irrelevant points? Do they seem to misinterpret emotions? Do they miss important parts of the picture? Do they miss important social cues? Um, it's all so perceptual integration relates not to IQ or even emotion, but it relates to how the person integrates stuff that's coming at them, because that's often how we formulate our response. So you're looking for evidence that the person misses important things or misinterprets it, or maybe doesn't sort of congregate the whole, but maybe gets sort of focused in on certain aspects or misinterprets things, because that often formulates how we um, how we respond to our environment based on how we interpret what's going on. Remember, and this is a psychological thing to keep in mind. Our response is not to the environment necessarily. Our response is to our perception of the environment. Our response is based on what we've taken in from the environment. So perceptual integration is important to try to measure, because you want to get a sense of what is the person focusing on when stuff's coming in. So that's perceptual integration, and that's why it's important. Notice here that you're not really talking even about the quality of the story. It's how the person formulated the story, what seemed to be the things they were focusing on, and what seemed to be the way they were integrating the information in order to formulate their response. How did they get to their response? Okay, so the next thing you want to look at is concrete versus abstract thinking. And, that seems to be, again, there's two levels. One is you look for specifics in each card in terms of, and then you also give an overall evaluation of the level of abstraction. And some things you're looking at, and I'm taking this, um, that you're looking at from the responses, is everything taken literally? Um, is there no attempt to tell a story about what's happening, but it's just more a description of literally what's in the picture? There's a person, there's a horse, and it may be that they're integrating. It may be, well, there's a person, there's a horse next to the person, and while they're standing there, someone's in the background with a sickle and a bunch of hay. Um, and so but it may not even be that what they're taking literally is um, is what's in the picture. It may be taking the instructions too literally, and each uh, when I mean take, I wanted to look that up because what I'd forgotten kind of what that means, because that can be a little tricky. But what it means by the instructions taken too literally is um, they are only mentioning specifically what you told them to mention, but they're not trying to integrate it. They're not really telling the story. They're just being very specific about addressing uh, each specific element of it, but not trying to tell a real story um, with it. There can also be, a sort of pattern of just describing how each item is used, but not really telling it in the story, just stating more factually how everything's used. So this question of abstract versus concrete thinking, and that's again, um, um, when we look at that abstract versus concrete thinking, it's how does the person interpret things? Do they tend to see just everything in very concrete terms, or are they able to abstract? Can they see the complexities in how things are related? Um, because life can be particularly difficult if you're addressing everything in very specific and concrete terms. It also could be, not necessarily, but it could be a symbol of defensiveness. People tend to be very concrete and literal, especially if they're responding very literally to the specific steps you gave them, rather than trying to make a story. They're just responding to each specific. That could suggest a real strong tendency to be defensive in terms of not wanting to reveal anything about themselves. But it also could be a degree of uh, difficulty the person has by not being able to recognize complexity in the material. Okay, now what we're going to move on next is information processing. So how are they processing the information once it's here? It's interesting that a lot of these, if that comes from these guidelines, is how does the narrator um, respond? So you're looking at the content, but you're also looking here as far as information to see evidence of how the person is processing the material once it comes in. Do they tend to get silly? Do they tend to make irrelevant comments? Do they complain? Do they complain of being bored or show evidence of being bored um, rather quickly? Do they shift perspective? Do they seem to be kind of bouncing from one thing to another? Um, do they describe the characters as being bored or not caring or being impulsive? So the degree of information and processing that you could be seeing is either um, the person acting in a way that suggests they're being impulsive, or it suggests they're arbitrarily shifting perspective, or also describing the characters as if they're bored or not caring. So that's the difference between the formal element of storytelling and the formal element of content. You are looking for how the person tells the story, and do they seem to bounce from one thing to another or complain of being bored. But then you also do they talk of the characters being bored or of not caring? Uh, so that's the um, time perspective. Does the time perspective um, seem vague or unrealistic? Is it more, does it seem appropriate, or does it seem more focused on immediate needs? And then when we go to process of reasoning, um, is it that the um, that it's unfocused as far as what goes on in the story? Are there contradictions? Is it unfocused? That also goes on the next one: coordination of inner and outer elements um, of the story. Does the approach that the person take to try to uh, describe what's going on in the main part of the story and in the background um, fit together? Or does there seem to be just entirely focused on the front or entire focus on the back? Um, does the person seem to bounce back and forth from it? And then when you get to the last one, coordination of perspective of different individuals, does there seem to be a way of tying all the characters um, together? So kind of notice what you go from the first talked about perceptual integration, and the second one, this one of information processing. With perceptual integration, you're looking at what does a person seem to be focused on when they're hit with the stimuli. And then for the information processing part, you're looking at what seems to happen once it's already in there, once they've taken in the information. What do they seem to know what to do with it, even if it looks like they were focusing on uh, maybe different parts of the picture that didn't seem relevant, or if they seem to misinterpret whether it was a violin, um, in the front or a school book. Um, One that's pretty common, one of the pictures, there's a person laying kind of, I forget which card it is, laying kind of slumped over with an object on the ground. Um, some people say that's a book, some people say that's a gun. And so the question isn't necessarily in this part, what does the person see, but once they interpret it as a gun or a book, what do they do with that information? Do they process it or do they totally ignore it? Or do they laugh and say it's a gun? Um, Again, it's this whole idea of information processing. How is the person working with the information once it's there? Sort of the general thing you're looking at is, do they seem to integrate it even if it's not quite clear what they were pulling in? Do they seem to integrate it or do they seem to bounce around a lot? Where you get a lot of studies that address this specific issue are ones related to studies of individuals with ADHD taking this test. You know, the sort of like bouncing around all over the place sort of thing, or not making good use of what they have there. So this is all about, the perceptual integration and the abstract versus concrete thinking, and um, the the information processing sections are all about what do they focus on, and then the information processing is what do they do once it's in there? Do they bounce all over the place? Does it seem to be an integrated whole of what they took in? Um, do they seem to be too um, concrete in what they're doing? Because I think, and then I'll move on to the emotion part, but I think what's useful to keep in mind about this is you have asked the person to give a task and you have asked them to tell a story. And a story involves a lot of different things. A story is meant to not only have certain elements, but they're meant to have certain elements that are tied together. And they are tied together in some sort of coherent fashion. And they're tied together in a coherent fashion that makes some sort of sense as an integrated whole. And it's not, and what it isn't is something that goes off in a lot of different directions or uh, switches um, concepts arbitrarily or switches focus arbitrarily. And that's what you're looking for to see if that, if anything like that is evident in how the person deals with the picture and specifically how they tell a story. So what you're looking for is how did they go about formulating a story. Okay, let's talk about how emotions are used in this material. Okay, when you deal with emotions in this, what you're looking for is evidence of there are different things you're looking for, but overall, what you're looking for is a level of maturity in terms of how the person deals with um, conceptualizing emotion in a story and how they resolve it. And again, there are different levels. The highest level, the best level, is when the person. So what you're looking for in all the aspects where you're looking at how the person deals with emotions is two things. Um, and I'll start here with the highest level. What you're looking at overall is to see, is there evidence that when the person deals with emotions, that they are following pro-social rules, that they are doing things that would be expect, or they are talking about how people respond to emotions and how they process emotions and what emotions they feel that would be appropriate to the type of situation they're talking about. They would be pro-social responses. And then the other is, does the response to emotion as the person describes them in the picture, are they long-term effective solutions that the person seemed to be looking for in the picture? Does the person describe response to emotions uh, that would be effective long term, or are they just describing ways that the person might respond to emotion to get some sort of immediate relief? Um, so the more long term effective approach to emotions is something you're looking for in a healthy, mature level of response to emotions in the picture. And then the lowest level, uh, disjointed, has to do with there doesn't seem to be any particular rule that the person is following. Um, they're just sort of the emotions all seem to be haphazard. And then the other one is um, not really coping. In other words, the response that's described in there is not one where the character seems to even be trying to come up with some long term coping strategy. They either are just not coping or they're describing in the picture as responding in a way that emotionally just is trying to get immediate relief. And then there's different levels in between. So what does this mean? And you can see in the descriptions that there's a number of ways these are addressed. I'll just go through them here. Um, Sources of the affect. Where is the emotion coming from? Is it an internal response to what's going out there? Is it entirely coming externally? uh, Coping, how is the person described as coping with the tension or the emotions? Is it immediate or is it long term? And emotional maturity, how complex are um, how complex are the emotions? Now, again, here you can read all this specific detail, but I want to talk about when we look at the emotional material in TAT stories. What we're looking for is how mature and complex is the person being when they deal, when they talk about dealing with emotions. You can't necessarily base it on the emotions that the person is feeling when they view the story because or when they view the card because some of the cards, as you can tell by looking for them, probably bring up negative emotions from the person. So if they feel negative when they see the card, that's to be expected. But what is more of an issue to look for here is how are they describing the process of how emotions are experienced? What is their view? Like I said, are they describing a complex experience of emotions that maybe is triggered by outside events but is seen as internal? Or is their focus only on the internal? Something happened and the person felt this way and that's it. There may be a complicated description of what goes externally, but as far as how the person feels, it's a very quick, well, of course they felt angry or they feel angry. Um, is there um, some sort of description to of how they respond to that anger that suggests a mature recognition of emotional experience, or does it seem to only be based on you know um, immediate gratification, just getting rid of the situation, not even trying to really cope with it? Now, having said that, you do want to look for evidence of strong emotions from the for the most part, the cards themselves should not elicit strong emotions from the individual, um, except to the degree that they describe it in the story. But if you notice the person possibly um, maybe having difficulty finishing a story because they get so weepy about what's happening in the picture, that's an indication of, their emotional response clearly impacting on their function, because you're asking them to do something that isn't really all that difficult, even emotionally taxing. And so, if they're having difficulty even completing that because of their own emotional response to the stimuli, um, then that's something to take note of. But in reality, what you're looking for is, as they describe the story, what does it seem to be they're doing with the emotional content in the picture? How are they describing people as having, as dealing with the emotions? Because um, in the end, that tells you something about how the person sees emotions, how they see the process of dealing with emotions, what that process should be. Okay, let's go on to the next one. And when you're looking for relationships, this comes down to the term that's used throughout this book is the term object relations when it comes to relationships. And object relations is, how do we integrate, how do we take in our relationships with other people? What do relationships mean to us in terms of how we view the world and the overall complexity of the world? And there are two things that are mentioned in the text here as far as being relevant to interpreting relationships when it comes to TAT stories. First is mutuality, and the other is autonomy. And basically, it says, how does a person's story reflect an understanding that we need social connectedness, we need social relationships, but we also need to be seen, we need to see ourselves as individuals. How does the person sort of integrate those two concepts in their stories? Is there a mature recognition that the individuals in the story um, interacting with each other and connected with each other, while at the same time recognizing each one of them as an individual? Or is there sort of just a disconnect from that whole sense? Either not seeing there as being a strong way of the people interacting with each other, or describing them only as a group and showing no focus on individuality. And I want to talk about some of the specific things that are brought up in the book as far as what sort of things you're looking for when it comes to this idea um, of um, autonomy and social connectedness. Um, so you're looking for, is there recognition of viewpoints of different actors, or is there a focus only on one actor in the ones that have multiple actors in them? Is there a superficial um, view of um, uh, of what the individuals are thinking, or what they are, how they're different from each other? Is that kind of superficial? Is there a are each character is it possible each character is being described, but each one is kind of described as the same, and they're just all slightly different? Or is there a real focus on individuality? So what each of the ones under relationships really addresses is, how maturely, how effectively are they describing the person or the people in the story as both connected and having a real reason to be connected, and a real mature way of interacting with each other and connecting with each other. Um, and also, is that described in the context of recognizing each person as an individual with their own unique perspectives and their own unique ways of doing things? When I think of relations, there certainly is um, relationships to be looked at in all of them. But the second card in the slides that I showed you, the farm picture, as you might describe it, is probably the best one, because there's several different people. And it's a farm. So, um, but each of the characters is drawn slightly differently. So they're each distinct from each other. So that card is a particularly good one for looking at object relations. What you want to do is get a sense when the person describes that picture that each one has their own way of being, their own way of thinking, their own way of responding to what's going on, while at the same time describing a solid interaction of what they're all doing on the farm together. Because it's that farm that also adds to it, because it's it's not always clear in some of the pictures why what is going on is going on. You know, there's the picture of the one girl in the tree and the one girl running. Um, that's a good one for addressing. Um, well, that's almost a good one. That's a really good one for almost the opposite of what the farm picture does, because the farm picture, um, there's a clarity of what they're all doing together. They're on a farm. So there should be some connectedness to um, how they all are operating on this farm and what is going on this farm. Um, when you look at um, the girl running away or running one way and the one girl being in the tree, it's unclear what's going on there. Something's going on, and um, it's not that there's a right or wrong answer there, but you want to get a sense of what does the person look for in making that decision of what's going on. So with the farm picture, you say, okay, when there's absolute clarity, or about as much clarity as you're going to get about how these people are interacting, how does the person process? Do they sort of go with it, you know, and talk about the farm and talk about what's going on the farm and how they're all farm, but recognize each as an individual, um, or do they just focus literally on each person as being almost the same as each other, um, but only slightly different, sort of like cogs in a machine, as opposed to individuals with their own perspectives. The picture with the girl in the tree and the girl running away, um, like I said, it's not that there's a right or wrong answer, but you want to look for what does the person address when they're talking about how those characters are related. You know, the most concrete, when I talked before about concreteness, the most concrete would be to not describe them as related. You know, there just happens to be one girl running and happens to be one girl in a tree, but there's no relationship between the two. That one is so clearly evident that there's something going on with the two of them, that to ignore the fact that they're connected would seem to be um, more an evidence of object relations than perceptual integration. Something is missing in terms of what the person looks for in a relationship that they would miss that those two are related, but it's arbitrary. So, what does the person look for identifying? Do they ignore the relationship altogether? Um, or do they focus on one more than the other? Do they immediately look for a conflict? Do they immediately look for one being in danger? Do they immediately look for the two of them playing some sort of game and therefore, you know, connecting in a healthy way? What do they look for? What's the thing they go for when they look for how those two are related? Um, and when they talk about them being related, do they abandon the sense that each are also individuals, um, or do they give a sense that um, uh, they both kind of have their different perspectives of what's going on? Okay, so you're looking for how do they not necessarily that there's a right or wrong story to tell there, but how do they perceive the relationship between the individuals, and how do they perceive each individual being an individual while also being in this relationship. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about as far as what's addressed in the stories and what you're looking for in the stories is motivation. And there's a bunch of different things that they talk about in here as far as motivation, but it really comes down to two major aspects. The first is, how does the person identify the problem and the conflict in the situation? Um, is it a realistic view of what is likely to be the main conflict um, and the main goal? Is it realistic, or do they seem to be um, unrealistic or vague in what the tension is and what the goal um, is in the when we gave the example last week of the the two examples of the TAT being given. The first one was card number one, the kid with the violin, and it was interesting that um, the the one storyteller sort of skipped over at all that there was a violin there, and there was that would be an example of, you know, the the tension. You would wonder why they would skip over um, the violin. You know, one possible interpretation of why there would be such a vague identification of what the tension is that um, once the person felt the tension um, related to possibly being made to practice, they kind of blocked that out and went more for, you know, a sort of more vague uh, source of tension. So it could be difficulty dealing with tension from authority. So you're looking for, I mean, that's just one possible interpretation, but you're looking for, you know, is there a realistic view of where the tension would be and what the goal is? So that's the first part. And then the second part is that the person seemed to formulate in their story a realistic plan of how to deal with the tension and how to reach the goal. So you're looking both at how does the person identify what the goal is and what the tension is, and then is there plan that they come up with in the story for how to address the tension and reach the goal? Is it a realistic plan, or do they seem to kind of go all over the place as far as where they think the characters are going to go? And notice these could be motivations that are either positive or negative. They could be describing the outcome and the goals as good or bad. You know, the girl, the one with the girls in the one running and the one in the tree. Um, the goal could be that they're playing a game, and that's a positive um, story about having fun, or the story could be that the girl in the tree is going to attack the girl who's running. You know, that maybe they're in a fight, and she's gonna jump on top of her. That itself doesn't reflect one thing or another, but it's because, you know, we all feel like fighting sometimes and we all feel like playing games sometimes. So the idea that either a positive or a negative outcome could be part of the story is not really the issue. The issue is um, what do they see as the source of the motivation or the source of the tension? Is that realistic? Does it seem to fit? Does it seem to come out of nowhere? Does it seem to be extreme? Um, what are the girl, you know, so maybe if you're looking at that picture of the girl in the tree and the girl running, it's not so much that they're in a fight, but where did the fight come from? What is the fight about? Why is she angry? Does it seem like a realistic tension, or is there a vagueness to it? And then the way that the person is going to deal with the motivation. Is it that she's up in a tree? Like even the one I brought up example, to be honest with you, would not be a particularly strong piece of evidence that the person is processing emotional material in an effective way, because she's up in a tree and the girl's running. If the idea is she's going to jump on her, I mean, she's pretty high up. So, she's either going to really do damage, which would mean she's really trying to hurt the girl, or she's going to hurt herself. I mean, you have to time that, and she's going to hit the ground. So, jumping out of the tree, even though that might, I like the jumping out of the tree because that might be the first thought. It's like, okay, I mean, she's in a tree, so she's going to jump. And the question is that how the person responds to emotional material? They kind of go with sort of the first response, even if it's not the most effective, or even if it's the one that could actually do damage to the actor or the one who's being acted on. Again, this whole idea of emotional experiences comes from um, how does a person process um, uh, motivation. I'm sorry. This whole thing about motivational material. How does a person process their motivation when they see that people have a goal to their behavior? Is their expectation that the goal is clear and is realistic to the situation, or is the goal almost always one of hurting someone, even if it's not clearly the most effective? And is the goal almost always wanting to hurt someone, even if um, there isn't evidence that that's definitely how the person's going? And what is the maturity? What is the healthiness of how the person sees that goal being reached and sees that tension as being acted on? Does it seem to be a healthy, mature way of how they're looking at it, or does it seem to be vague and disconnected? Um, Now, what you also will tend to do with each card is rate them as far as self regulation. And that's sort of like the overall picture of how the person is processing the story. Does it seem overall that the person is relating the characters in a mature way while looking at them as individuals, while focusing on the picture as a whole and taking in all aspects of the picture? Or does it seem to be um, disorganized and disread? Do emotions tend to take over? Does the person tend to give in to their tendency to want to look at all sorts of different aspects? Is it disjointed? Um, so the disjointed dysregulation level would be sort of the lowest level, where there's like no real connectedness in any sort of effective way of all the different parts. And then the first one would be the more mature, where the person is sort of self-regulating things so that they're not being overwhelmed by emotions or off guard because of poor perceptual integration. It's kind of tying everything together. So what I wanted to say here is all of these are in the context of what are called imports. And imports are the material that the person brings to the story. And what they bring to the story is, when they're telling the story, is how are they processing material, or how are they taking material in, how are they processing it, how are they using their understanding of relationships, motivation, and goal setting, and then how is their experience of emotions affecting all of this. So it's all that ties together in the story that the person tells. And what you're looking at is trying to see how all those parts relate to each other when you interpret the stories. Okay, this is a good place to stop. I also want you to have read the chapters from the book on the TAT, and we'll pick all this up on Thursday.